The Lighthouse Job. Started with a light that didn't come on. Just east of Toronto, the Point Stoddart Lighthouse. Been keeping ships safe since before the war. Rain or shine, storm or still. Its keeper, Gus Larrigan, was as reliable as tide and time. Till one night, the lamp stayed dark. No signal, no radio, no sign of Gus. Harbor Patrol said it was nothing, probably a busted generator. Maybe the old man fell asleep. But one voice refused to let it go. A voice loud enough to rattle windows and roll kegs off the dock. Declan Malloy, retired sergeant, harbor legend. Too stubborn to quit and too sentimental to leave a friend behind. And when Brick walks into Mick and Mac's office, well, things tend to get wetter, weirder, and a whole lot more dangerous. Smugglers, secrets, a lighthouse that watches more than it warns. The mystery hiding just below the surface. This is The Lighthouse Job, a Mick and Mac mystery. Only on Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Chapter 1. The Keeper's Silence. The morning hit like a fist to the temple, hard, damp, and unwelcome. A cold drizzle climbed out Toronto's East End, kind of weather that made even the streetcars look tired. Inside their drafty second-floor office, Mick McCathie poured the first cup of the day, black and bitter as remorse, while Mack MacNeely attempted to coax life out of the office radiator by kicking it and swearing in alphabetical order. They were halfway between Gadzooks and holy smokes when the door crashed open. "Where's the brains of this operation?" barked a voice like a bar brawl in progress. In the doorway stood a man the size of a refrigerator, and just as subtle. Soaked to the bone, coat flapping, cap askew. Carried the scent of pipe tobacco, dead fish, and righteous fury. "Malloy," Mick said, without looking up from his coffee. "You're dripping on our case files." "Good," said Brick. "They look too dry to be doing any actual work." Declan Malloy slammed the door behind him and stomped across the room, leaving a trail of lake water and fury. Mac raised an eyebrow. "Take a wrong turn to the docks or just swim in for exercise?" "I rode, if you must know," Brick grunted, collapsing into the client chair. 4 miles. In that. He jabbed a thumb at the window, where the rain had turned the world into watercolor. "Why?" Mick asked. "Because," Brick said, pulling a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket and attempting to wring out his sleeves, "Gus Larrigan has gone quiet." That got their attention. "Gus the keeper?" said Mac. "Point Stoddart," Brick confirmed. "Hasn't lit the lamp in 3 nights. No radio chatter, no lantern flashes, not even a blasted foghorn. Could have lost power. He's got backup generators, kerosene, spare everything. I know that light like I know my own boot." Brick slapped the desk. "And that light is out." Mick leaned back. "You report it?" "To Harbor Patrol. He said maybe he took ill, or maybe he took up drinking. I said Gus hasn't touched a drop since 1936, unless you count communion wine and cod liver oil. And they told me to shove off unless I was bringing them fish." Mac winced. "Bet you didn't take that well." "Told him to go sit in an anchor," Brick growled. "Then I came here. The people who still believe a missing man might be missing." There was a long pause. Outside, the rain ticked steadily against the window like a bad clock. "Let's say we check it out," Mick said. "You know the route?" "At the back of my balled-up fist." "And you'll come along?" Mac asked. "Of course I'm coming along. Just checking. You do swim, right?" Brick hesitated. Mick and Mac exchanged a glance. "I float," Brick said finally, "under duress." Mick sipped his coffee. "Better pack a second life vest." Chapter 2. Fog and Feathers. The lake had a way of swallowing sound. By the time Mick, Mack, and Brick were halfway out to Point Stoddart, steady churn the boat's motor was the only thing left in the world. Behind them, the Toronto skyline vanished into the haze like a half-remembered dream. Ahead, a wall of fog rolled in with the quiet menace of a closing door. Brick stood at the bow like a figurehead carved by an angry dock worker, arms crossed, jaws set, slouch cap pulled low. The man didn't believe in oilskins or life vests. He believed in glaring at the weather until it backed off. Max squinted through the mist. It's like rowing into the inside of a snow globe someone forgot to shake. Fog like this will take your bearings, Brick muttered. Take your name too if you let it in. Mick adjusted the throttle, keeping the boat slow and steady. We'll be on top of the rocks before we see the lighthouse. We'll be on top of something, Max said. What's that, off to port? A dark shape floated just ahead, bobbing gently in the water. As he drew closer, it resolved in the outline of a rowboat. Old, paint peeling, rope dragging behind it. Mick cut the motor. The fog pressed in like wool. Brick hooked the edge of the boat with a gaff and reeled it closer. Sweet Mary, he breathed. That's Gus's skiff. Inside, water pooled ankle deep. Broken oar lay cracked across the seat. And draped over the bow, soaked through and heavy with brine, was Gus Larrigan's coat. Brick lifted it like it might fall apart. He'd never leave this behind. Mick peered inside the boat. No blood, no sign of a fight. Something happened. Maybe he dropped it, went back for supplies, and it drifted, Mac offered. No, said Brick. You don't drop your coat in that lake. You wear it or you bury it. The silence settled again. Just a creep of the water, a dull thud of worry in Mick's chest. They reached the rocky outcrop of Point Stoddart an hour later. The lighthouse towered ahead, pale, narrow, and silent. Its lens dark. No sign of light. No sign of Gus. Mick beached the boat and they clambered ashore, boots crunching wet gravel. Brick led the way with the certainty of a man who knew the place by smell. Front door's this way, he said, rounding the base of the tower. Tried the knob. Locked. From the inside. Mac raised an eyebrow. Think we knock? Brick didn't answer. He stepped back, took a breath, drove his shoulder into the door like a battering ram. Flew open with a crack and a puff of sea-damp dust. Gus always said I had poor manners, Brick muttered, stepping over the threshold. Inside, the lighthouse was strangely untouched. The main room was quiet, clean, even cozy. A kettle sat cold in the stove. A plate of food, potatoes, pickled herring, and a half a biscuit rested on the small kitchen table, half eaten. No signs of a struggle, Mick murmured. No blood. No overturned furniture. No Gus, Mac added. Brick moved slowly through the room, like walking through someone else's memory. This place hasn't changed in 20 years. They climbed the narrow wooden stairs toward the upper levels. Dust shifted underfoot. The lantern roof above loomed in silence. Halfway up the steps, Mac paused. Wait, what's that? He crouched and picked something up from the stair tread. It was a feather. Long, narrow, and shimmering with dark iridescence. Had a purplish sheen, almost oily. Not like a gull's feather. Not local. Brick leaned in. That isn't from anything native to this coast. Mick frowned. You recognize it? Brick turned it slowly between two fingers. Closest thing I ever saw was back in Burma. Jungle birds, mean things, loud. This is wrong. Wrong how, Mac asked. It don't belong here, Brick said, like it got brought. Outside, a gull cried. Inside, the three men stared at a single, silent feather in the darkness that had settled over Point Stoddart. Chapter 3. The Man in the Cormorant Coat. By late afternoon the fog had thinned, but not vanished, hovering like a rumour above the rocks, never quite lifting. The wind came in slow, salty gusts, rattling the lighthouse shutters and whispering across the shoreline like it knew something it wasn't telling. Mick sat cross-legged in the kitchen, brushing away dust from the floorboards. Mack was upstairs, trying to coax life out of the dormant lantern. Brick was near the fireplace, crouched low with a poker, jabbing at the ashes in the old iron stove. "You're not going to find Gus in there," Mick muttered. Brick grunted. "Looking for a signal. People who vanish sometimes leave smoke." "What do you think happened?" "I think if Gus left of his own accord," Brick said, straightening, "he'd have told me. And I think if he didn't, someone else made the choice for him." He limped over to the wall and tapped the wood near the baseboard. "You know," Brick said, lowering himself onto a stool with a long creak, "this place was used for more than keeping ships on the straight and narrow." "Meaning?" "Meaning back in the 20s. This island was part of a whiskey run. Lantern signals at dusk. One blink, two blinks, flash, hold. For which boat came to port, which went round the bluff to Port Hope." Mick tilted his head. "Talking about smugglers." "Talking about Cormorant Jack," Brick said, with the reverence one might use for a particularly well-aged brawler. Tall fella, always wore a coat made of black feathers. Claimed he could talk to birds. Nobody ever knew his real name. Mick raised an eyebrow. "You don't actually believe." "I believe Gus used to tell me not to laugh when the birds watched too long from the rocks." At that moment, Mac's voice echoed down the stairs. "Fellas, you might want to see this." They found him in the lamp room, kneeling beside a loose floorboard pried up with the butt of his flashlight. Beneath it, tucked in a weathered oilskin folder, were pages yellowed with age, covered in dots, dashes, and neat, handwritten notes. "Code sheets," Mac said. "Morse. Looks like patterns for prearranged messages." Nick flipped through them. "Here, this one says, 3 short, 1 long, cargo ready. 2 long, 1 short, boat inbound." Brick let out a low whistle. Cormorant Jack wasn't just an old pub story after all. As dusk deepened, the air turned glassy and still. Mick stood at the lantern with Gus's old signal torch in hand. It was a heavy brass-hooded beast of a thing with a shuttered front and a grip that could break a knuckle if you weren't careful. "Anyone out there still using this code?" Mick asked. "Only way to find out," Brick replied, staring across the darkening lake. Then Mick pointed. There. Far off, almost invisible against the twilight horizon, a pinprick of light flashed. Once, twice, pause. Then again. Mick counted, 3 short, 1 long. "Cargo ready," Mac murmured. They exchanged a glance. "Answer it," Brick said. Mick raised the torch and mimicked the same flash pattern. A moment later a response came, slightly altered. 2 long, 1 short. "Boat inbound," said Brick. "Could be Gus," Mac said, uncertain. "Could be," Brick agreed. "But here's the trouble." He paused, eyes narrowing on the lake, voice turning low. "Either Gus is out there, or someone else knows the old code." Outside, the lake stretched silent and black as ink. And somewhere beyond the fog, something was moving toward them. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Cellar. The cellar door creaked like an old secret. Mick held the lantern low as they descended the narrow wooden stairs, each step groaning under the weight of unease. And Brick. "Smells like seaweed and rust," Mac muttered. "My 2 least favorite sandwiches." The basement was low-ceilinged and damp, with a faint tang of brine in the air. Old shelves lined the walls. Canning jars, storm lanterns, coils of rope, and a few rusted tools long past retirement. Gus kept this place like a church, Brick said softly. No mess, no fuss. Mick scanned the corners. And what's this? Tapped his boot against a low section of the wall where the concrete was newer, slightly raised, just enough to hide a seam. A latch glinted faintly near the floor. Brick crouched down, gave it a tug, and a click echoed through the silence. A trap door opened, revealing a sloping tunnel dug into the shoreline rock. Mack peered in. Either Gus took up gophering, or we just found something real interesting. The tunnel was narrow but passable, reinforced with wooden beams and old electrical wire. After 10 feet, it opened to a small chamber, a rough cavern, its ceiling dripping, the floor packed dirt. And stacked against one wall were crates. Old, wooden, stenciled in faded Cyrillic. Russian, Mick muttered. Could be Cold War surplus, Brick added. Or contraband. Smugglers moved anything the price was right. Vodka? Weapons? Mack guessed. Brick shrugged. Maps, film, people. I've seen it all. Mick moved to examine a crate, then stopped cold. A click. Mack, he said carefully, don't move. Mack froze, one foot barely raised. Brick knelt and pulled back a canvas flap, revealing a tripwire stretched taut just above ankle height. Booby trap, Brick growled. Flare gun, wired to the lid. Mick carefully slid his knife from his coat. Cutting it on 3. 1. Wait, Mack whispered. 2. I hate 3. 3. Snip. The wire went slack. 3 of them exhaled in unison. Whoever set this up wasn't planning on coming back, Mick said. No, Brick murmured. But Gus wouldn't booby-trap his own pantry. In the far corner, a rusted oil drum sat with its lid ajar. Brick walked to it, lifted a folded piece of canvas, found a weather-worn journal tucked beneath. He held it with reverence. Gus's. The pages were brittle, written in Gus's tight, looping hand. Most of it was code, initials, weather patterns, shipping notations. But one page near the middle had a passage, circled twice in pencil. The birds return with the tide. If I don't light the lamp, they'll think I'm gone. Brick stared at it, and reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the strange feather Mack had found on the stairs. This ain't from a gull, he said, voice low. It's a bird called a nicobar. Bright feathers, oily sheen. They nest in jungle brush. I saw one in Burma. Gus saw it too. He had to camp in a temple during the retreat. Mick leaned in. You think he left it for you to find? Brick nodded slowly. He knew I'd recognize it didn't belong. He knew I wouldn't stop looking. They stood there in silence, 3 men, surrounded by crates, secrets, and the damp beneath of the lake pressing in around them. And he's alive, Mack said. Whoever took him wanted us to think he wasn't. Brick looked down at the journal again. And they're coming back. Chapter 5. Light in the Dark. The island changed at night. Fog drifted like ghosts between the trees. The lake turned from steel to ink, and the lighthouse dark, watchful, so like a sentinel refusing to speak. From the lantern room, Mick watched the tugboat creep closer, its silhouette just a smudge against the moonlit horizon. No running lights, no sound, just a slow drift on careful currents, slipping toward shore like a pickpocket at a crowded market. They're coming in quiet, Mack said, crouched beside a crate of Gus's old signal flags. Too quiet. Brick stood against a stone, hands on his hips. "Let 'em try quiet. I've got Loud covered." They'd set the ambush in the lower chamber, near the trap door that led from the shoreline tunnel into the lighthouse basement. Mick had positioned himself behind a supply crate. Mack waited near the stairs with a length of rope. Brick refused to hide. "Are you sure about this?" Mick asked. Brick unbuttoned his coat. "They took Gus. They used his light. They sent a message. I'm sending one back." Footsteps echoed from the tunnel. A shadow emerged. Leaner, younger, moving with the kind of practiced caution that didn't come from nerves, but from experience. Carried no weapon, Mick could see, but there was a blade's tension in his shoulders. Brick stepped into the open. "Well," he called, "you here to deliver something? Or are you just lost and rude?" The man froze. His face came into view, slightly gaunt, with high cheekbones and the dull eyes of someone used to looking over their shoulder. "I'm not here to fight," the man said. "Good," Brick said, "because I'd win." Mick emerged slowly, hands just away from his pockets. "Name?" The man looked at each of them before answering. "Finn Rykov." Mack blinked. "The dock worker? You were arrested last spring for moving stolen radio equipment out of Hamilton." "Charges didn't stick," Rykov said, "and I'm not here for that." "What are you here for?" Mick asked. "I'm here to tell you," Rykov said slowly, "that Gus Larrigan is alive. But if you want him to stay that way, you walk off this island now and forget you ever came." Brick took one step forward. "You've got 2 seconds to explain how you know Gus is alive." Rykov didn't flinch. "Because I brought him food yesterday." That stopped them. "Where is he?" Mick demanded. "I don't know anymore," Rykov said. "They moved him after you started poking around." "Who's they?" Mack asked. Rykov just smiled. "You don't want to know." A long pause. Tension pulled the air taut. Then Brick swung. It wasn't fast, but it didn't have to be. His fist caught Rykov in the side and sent him stumbling sideways. Rykov slammed into a crate, rolled, and sprinted for the tunnel entrance. "Get him!" Mack shouted. Mick lunged, but Rykov was fast, too fast. He slipped in the shadows and was gone. Brick stood in the center of the room, breathing heavy. Mick turned toward him. "That was not the plan." "I adjusted it," Brick growled. "Now I've got a better one." He marched past him up the stairs and into the lantern room. "Where are you going?" Mack called after him. "To do what Gus would have done." Brick struck a match, lit the old ignition wick, began coaxing life into the gas mantle. The beacon flared, flickered, and then roared to life, casting a golden glow across the rocks and lake. Mick stood beside him. "You'll tip them off. They'll know we're still here." "Good," Brick said, staring into the night. "Let 'em know. Let everyone know." Turn the beacon to its full sweep. "This light," he said, voice low, "was never just for ships. It's for Gus. And if he's out there, he'll see it. He'll know I didn't stop looking." Far below, the tugboat veered slightly, now circling the island like a shark that knew it had been spotted. Brick watched, unblinking. Mick said nothing, because what was there to say when a man used light as a promise? Chapter 6. The storm breaks. The storm didn't roll in. It charged. By midnight, Lake Ontario had thrown off its stillness like a cheap disguise. Rain came sideways, driven by gusts that howled through the lighthouse eaves like a choir of furious ghosts. The beacon's golden eyes sliced through the dark, illuminating flashes of white caps and the black hulk of the tugboat, now anchored uncomfortably close to the rocks. Inside the tower, everything shook. Mick peered through the rain-slicked binoculars from the lantern room. He's tethered just outside the cove. No lights, no crew on deck. If Gus is on board, he's below. "We go during the break in the rain," Mac said, tying off his coat. "Storm gives us cover. You sure you can row in that?" Mac gave him a look. "You plan to swim?" Mac grimaced. "Let's hope the tug's got a nice dry brig." Downstairs, Brick checked the tunnel entrance, then settled in a rickety wooden chair near the base of the spiral stairs, shotgun resting across his lap like an old friend. The wind thudded against the lighthouse like a boxer working a heavy bag. He didn't flinch. "You'll come for him tonight," he muttered to the storm. "Come for Gus. Try and take the rest." But it wasn't the storm that arrived first. It was footsteps. Crunching, heavy, slow, but purposeful. Not lost, not rushed, like someone who didn't need to hide. Brick stood. A figure stepped through the door, dripping and silent. A tall man in a long oilskin coat, black, weathered, and unmistakably adorned with cormorant feathers sewn along the shoulders and collar like some obscene epaulet. His face was lined, eyes sharp, beneath a brimmed hat, slick with rain. "Evening," the man said, voice gravel smooth. "You must be the welcoming committee." Brick held the shotgun steady. "Jack." The man smiled faintly. "Haven't been called that in a while? Thought it was just a sailor's tale." "You're uglier than I imagined," Brick said. "The coat's right." Jack stepped forward slowly. "Let's not pretend. You're outnumbered, outarmed, and you lit a signal for half the lake to see." "You worry?" Brick said. "Not yet." Jack took another step. The barrel of Brick's shotgun didn't waver. "You're bluffing," Jack said. "That old thing hasn't fired since the Depression." Brick gave a wide grin. "Maybe it's due." He stepped back just one pace and bumped the lever for the trapdoor winch with his heel. Click. The trap sprang open beneath Jack. There was a yelp, a brief flail of black feathers, and then Jack vanished in the cellar below with a thud that echoed through the lighthouse like Judgment Day. Mick Mac burst through the doorway, dripping and windblown. "What was that?" Mac shouted. "Cormorant," Brick said, cocking the shotgun. "Bagged one." They descended in the cellar and found Jack sprawled on the floor, dazed but cursing in at least 2 languages. Beside him, slumped against a crate and nursing a bruised jaw, was Finn Rykov, caught mid-escape with a coil of rope and a boot half on him. Well, Mac said. "Look what washed up." Mick tied Jack's wrist with an old dock line, while Mac sat in Rykov and helped himself to the man's cigarettes. "Who do you think you're messing with?" Brick barked. "This island raised better men than you've got tricks." Jack spat blood. "You're all fools. You don't know what you've stumbled on." Brick leaned in close. "Then enlighten us, feather boy. We've got all night. And I'm not known for my gentle interview technique." They bound them both and hauled them into the kitchen. Rain lashed the windows. Lightning lit the room in silver strobes. Mick stared out at the tug, rocking down the storm. "Still one piece missing," he said quietly. "Gus," Brick replied. And somewhere beyond the rain, the keeper still waited. Chapter 7. The Keeper's Return. The tugboat groaned against its moorings like it wanted no part in what came next. Mick climbed aboard first, flashlight sweeping over rusted railings and wet decks. Mac followed, muttering about tetanus, sea monsters, and what he suspected was the smell of boiled cabbage. Brick stayed behind, guarding the prisoners and glaring at the rain like it had personally insulted his mother. The engine room was locked from the outside. A heavy padlock, hastily bolted. Mick broke it with a pry bar, pushed the hatch open, and found Gus Larrigan inside, alive. Sitting on an overturned bucket, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like diesel and fish stew, Gus blinked against the sudden light. While he rasped, voice dry as dust, "About time you showed up." Mac let out a breath and grinned. "You know, for a guy who didn't want company, sure know how to draw a crowd." Gus stood shakily. "I take it they didn't find the key." "No," Mick said, helping him up. "But your friend brought the right hammer." Back on shore, Brick waited like a cliff carved in a human form. When he saw Gus, alive, upright, and stubborn as ever, his face cracked into something between a grin and a sob. "You old sea hen," Brick muttered, pulling him into a hug that was mostly shoulder slaps and throat clearing. "You look terrible." "I smell worse," Gus said, smiling through cracked lips. "And I'm breathing." Back inside the lighthouse, Mick handed the coded journal and the trapdoor crate manifest over to an RCMP officer. Too much starch in his collar, not enough sense in his eyes. "Smuggling ring?" the officer asked. "Looks like it," Mick said. "Old codes, old roots. Reawakened for Cold War purposes. Find more in the tunnel." "And the two suspects?" "Tied up in the kitchen," Max said cheerfully. "But don't untie the big one, unless you want to learn new curse words." Brick, meanwhile, loaded Gus gently into the old skiff, then climbed in behind him. "You sure you want to row in this weather?" Mac called from the dock. Brick grabbed one oar, just one, and raised it like a salute. "He's lighter than he used to be." Mick handed him a flashlight. "Stay visible." "I am visible," Brick shot back. "I'm in an international spectacle." As they pushed off, Gus gave a little wave. Brick immediately veered to the left. "You've got to use both oars," Gus said. "Then you paddle, you old barnacle." Mac watched him drift off, circling slowly and arguing the entire way. "Think they'll make it?" he asked. Mick nodded. "Eventually. Or die trying. Either way, they'll be loud about it." Epilogue. The light stays on. Weeks later, Mick and Mac returned to Point Stoddart. The lighthouse had been repaired. Windows reglazed, floors swept. The beacon turned steady as a heartbeat. The gulls circled overhead in lazy loops, indifferent as always. Gus stood at the top, polishing the lens like it owed him rent. "Back in your post," Mick called up. "Can't let the lake win," Gus said without turning. "Someone's got to keep an eye on the horizon." They stepped around to the east side of the tower, where a new wooden sign hung beside the door. The letters were uneven, the paint a little too bright, but the message was clear. Malloy & Co. Lake Security. Established? Never. But try and stop us. Mac lit a cigar and chuckled. "Think he's serious?" "He's got a boat and a grudge," Mick said, smiling. The fog rolled in again, curling around their coats like smoke from a long story. A gull cried overhead, loud, sharp, and almost amused. The lake stretched out before them, deep and silent. But the light stayed on. The case closed. This has been another episode of the Mick and Mac Mysteries, only on Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. Stay tuned for more tales of murder, mischief, and mystery, straight from the streets of post-war Toronto. Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. Available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Subscribe to Ontario Cold Cases today so you never miss an episode. And please share your thoughts and questions in the comments.